Hello and welcome to the second part of our special edition of Monthly Report. With us, we have three special guests, all professors from Nova SBE, Professor Cátia Batista, Professor Pedro Brinca, and Professor Susana Peralta. In this second part, we are going to discuss the new migrant crisis in Europe. My name is Hugo Marques de Sousa, and this is Connected, the podcast of Nova Economics Club.
The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
Is that he were rather the poor were poorer.
This can be the most important step we could take to prevent another recession.
On May the 17th, around 9,000 people crossed the borders between Morocco and the neighboring Spanish city of Ceuta after the decision of Moroccan authorities of temporarily opening the gates at the border and not stopping citizens of crossing it. This event happened while diplomatic tensions between Morocco and Spain were already heating up after Spain's decision of admitting and giving medical treatment to Brahim Ghali, head of the Polisario Front, an advocate of the independence of Western Sahara from Morocco. But, regardless of what reasons allowed migrants to cross borders, the fact is that many have long waited for an opportunity to cross it. With humanitarian and economic conditions worsening all over Africa in the past year due to COVID-19, many are desperate and willing to risk their lives to reach the promised European lands in what might become a new wave of illegal migration from Africa to Europe. In the first half of 2021, the number of irregular migrants reaching Spain by sea increased by 50% when compared to the same period in 2020, and that number didn't include the thousands of migrants that entered Ceuta in May. So, Professor Cátia Batista, I start with you. In the last few months, Europe has been facing a new increased wave of illegal migrants, like the recent case in Morocco. What does the evidence tell us about the motivations of these migrants? Are their motivations mainly economically driven, related to economic struggles in the origin countries, increased difficulty in legal migration during the pandemic, and even climatic conditions? Or is this spike in migration mainly driven by diplomatic tensions between Morocco and Spain? What do you think?
Okay, so thank you very much for the question, Hugo. And I think, there's a lot in it. So let me try to break into two pieces and talk about it. So
yes, because you came from a flight from recently in a trip where you were investigating this kind of this new migration crisis, right?
Yes, so we are actually reporting on a project we did with 4,000 potential migrants in Gambia, which is the country in West Africa that has the highest irregular migration rate to Europe. So we have been studying this. Let me start by saying, so we typically call these migrants, it's not that they are illegal, okay? So it's really about them not having the way to get to Europe through legal pathways, okay? So typically we refer to them as irregular migrants. And this crisis, let me say, it's not, okay? So this is something that has been growing in the past decade at least. So in 2015, for example, we had 1 million people getting to Europe through Italy, and they were coming from places as diverse as Syria or Northern or West Africa, okay? But there were different types of people arriving to Europe. You had about 500,000 that were war refugees, mainly coming from Syria, okay? So at that time, everyone was talking about refugees, but actually, so half of these million people that arrived to Europe in 2015 were actually economic migrants. Some economic migrants are difficult to distinguish from actual asylum seekers. They are actually facing quite desperate conditions, and sometimes they are coming from countries that have political conditions that can justify that they receive asylum upon arrival to Europe. So Gambia is one of these countries. So so there was a change in political power, but before that, actually these economic migrants, you might call them that, they were asking for asylum upon arrival to Europe because they had an autocratic regime at home that justified that they granted asylum status. But typically what we found, for example, in this research that we did, is that, well, these people are really desperate because they don't have jobs at home, they don't have aspirations. And we should think that typically Africa has, demographic pyramid is the exact opposite or inverse of the European. Whereas in Europe, we are getting old as a society. Africa is the opposite. It's the biggest continent, is a country that has growing population. And this is a big challenge because the economy does not have employment, jobs that can give aspirations to young people. And so it is in this context that we can understand these studies that we did, where, for example, we learned that people, like more than half of the people in our sample, randomly sampled from rural areas in the Gambia, so half of the sample were willing to come to Europe, and yet they had the expectation that 1 out of 2 of them would die in the way. Okay, this is very dramatic, and this is all before the pandemic. So, okay, so it's not really new after the pandemic. So what we saw before the pandemic was that people were really willing to risk their lives. They saw no perspective at home. Okay, and so what we saw is that these people were typically coming through the Mediterranean. The central Mediterranean route is a route that starts in West Africa, gets them to the Sahara Desert, ends up in Libya. Okay, so, and then crosses the Mediterranean, typically to Italy. And so what happens here is that in the desert, many times these people are in these trucks, open box trucks, where they are left, they fall out of the truck because it's too full with people, and they are left to die in the desert. And then oftentimes they are smuggled into Libya. In Libya, they are subject to trafficking and exploitation. And it's only after that that they cross the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean, which is very highlighted by the media, the death rate there, it's like 5%, but with the rest of the route is actually about 30%. So 1 out of 3 people is actually dying in this route. And yet people, sometimes they believe that it is the risk and they are willing to take it because clearly there are no alternatives. So what our project did was exactly to experimentally test different alternatives to this route. So we were on the one hand providing information. On the other hand, we were providing vocational training, trying to get these young men to have skills so that they could maybe, do other jobs in their home country or come to Europe better prepared to achieve legal status, for example. And a third policy that we tested was to facilitate regional migration, because in this area of Africa, West Africa, there is free circulation of people like we have in the European Union. And so we tried to facilitate this by giving them information and facilitating contacts with an immigrant association in Dakar, where they could get support and some cash for the initial days upon arrival. So our results showed that providing information on its own is not enough. So people did not really change their decisions because presumably they already know. They know that, as I told you before, even though they believe that 50% of people trying this route die, they still want to do it. Okay, so more promising was this vocational training policy. The vocational training policy was the single one that actually decreased the steps that people are taking in order to migrate, because one thing that we should know is that these irregular migration trips, okay, they are very costly. You have to pay the smugglers. These people are living on $1 a day, and they have to pay the smugglers like $2,000. So they basically, people, borrow from everyone they know, and it takes them years of planning in order to be able to do this trip. Okay, and so what we saw here is that this vocational training was the policy that actually decreased the steps their migrants were taking in order to emigrate, and they also decreased their actual intention to migrate to Europe. Then finally, these other policy on trying to promote regional migration. So the final intervention was this intervention designed to facilitate regional migration, and it was effective. So we saw more people staying long-term. So, and long-term here, we only measured this for a little more than 1 year, but we did see that some people decided, instead of doing internal migration, so there was some rural to urban migration within the Gambia. So we saw more people doing migration to Senegal, which is a richer country, and they stayed there long-term. But we did not see any change in these intentions of people to migrate to Europe. And I should say that one of the things that we learned in all of this process is that Europe, in West Africa, and in many of these poor countries, I mean, Northern Africa as well, is the El Dorado. Okay, so people know that they are facing terrible risks when they take this journey, but they also have some information gaps related to what it is to be a migrant in Europe. And they think, even when they are irregular, that they will do very well. And this, I mean, we also did some field work with migrants in Italy, and we learned that, yeah, the information that they send back home is always a glossy one. And this is one of the issues in this, in this decision-making process for these migrants. Now, you also asked me, and I'll try to make it brief. We also asked me about COVID, the pandemic, and how it has changed this phenomenon of irregular migration to Europe. So what we found in our work is that actually actual migration to Europe has been decreasing a lot. It is still occurring, but especially in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that there was a huge drop, but this was very temporary. So lately, what we have been seeing is that it has increased, okay, and we see the news, and the news about Spain are closer to us, maybe that's why we pay attention. So what we see, I mean, the episode in Ceuta was really a one-off thing, okay? So there was an opportunity related to this diplomatic incident, but these were 8,000 people only, okay? So it's a lot of people, especially over a very short number of days, but this is just a reflection of something that is there, this tendency, this desire to get your family to a safer and a better life. But so what we have been seeing after the pandemic is, first, the irregular migration is falling because people are poorer. I mean, economic crisis is not only a reality in Europe. When we have these restrictions to international mobility, for example, tourism is not coming to these countries. Tourism is a huge source of income to countries in West Africa, to Morocco, to many countries. And so there is this, and then there is the remittances of migrants. Migrants in Europe are a very important source of funding for living conditions in these countries, and remittances are down a lot. When you look at official numbers, macro numbers, you think they are resisting a lot, but no, what is happening is that because you don't have migrants flying back home, they are not bringing money in person, and so you seem to see artificially in the macro data that remittances did not fall because of the pandemic, but it's not true. When we do surveys with families in these areas, they really report us that they are increasing. Basically, the remittances by formal channels have increased, but they are not offsetting by enough the informal channels that used to be the most typical. And so people have less money because the economy is in crisis, because they receive remittances, and hence they do not have the money to emigrate currently. And so you see less migration, but the intentions to migrate are still very high. We still get 50% of this was data that we collected at the end of 2020. Okay, people still have very high intentions to migrate. And this recent episode, okay, so to Ceuta, which I think is just episodic, but also to the Canary Islands, which is a new route. That is a new route. Before, people were not trying to, we're doing mostly the Mediterranean route and not the Atlantic, but for example, the Canary Islands, we have seen several thousands of people going to the Canary Islands, and there they are also dying a lot. Okay, so the sea is very risky. What is happening is that we don't even have the numbers on how many people die.
It's not the sea, it's the Atlantic Ocean. I mean,
yes,
that's
it's also
the other is the sea and the other is the ocean. That's what makes it more dangerous.
Yes. Exactly.
No, but I mean, honestly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's
no, sorry, right? And people might not understand.
The distinction is exactly that one.
Precisely, yeah. And the thing is, whereas in the Mediterranean, I mean, there are, we never have precise numbers on these deaths because many people that die, I mean, we never see them again. But in the Atlantic Ocean, okay, this happens even more. Okay? So our numbers, like last year it was reported that nearly 1,000 people died, but this for sure lower bound. So this is just to say that post-pandemic, we still have a lot of people wanting to migrate to Europe. They cannot afford to do so. So we should expect that this migration pressure is increasing in the future. And then we see that people are trying new routes. And another thing that gives us this lack of alternatives is the fact that you see full families migrate. okay, this migration through the Mediterranean was mostly, okay, except for Syrian, which was a different circumstance, was mostly single males. Here we are seeing lots of families. We see babies in the boats, and this is an indicator that the economic conditions in these countries are really deteriorating. I think, yeah, maybe there are other things that we can discuss, but I think I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And about this, if it is something that is just now, or if we are going to see more and more migrants in the future, what do you think, Professor Pedro Brinca? Do you think that after the pandemic we are going to see more economic migrants to come to Europe, or is this an isolated episode?
Well, if you want to know these kind of questions, you should really ask Cátia, because she's like a oh my god expert of migration at Nova. She knows a lot more about it than I do, for sure. But if I want to contribute a little bit, there's two thoughts that I just want to pause. The first one is, as I referred at the beginning, this is a crisis that affects countries, people, sectors, firms in many different ways, right? And if in developed countries, service-based economies that create value added through, I don't know what Susana would call the bourgeoisie teletrabalho, it's much less affected than in countries where people actually have to, have more menial tasks where they have to physically interact with each other. So they're much more conditioned, exposed to diseases, much less, conditions to respond in a case of infection in a way that you kind of, have good prognostic. So these countries are bound to be more hit in some senses. I mean, of course, because they are younger, the severity of disease on the average case might not be as acute, but at the end of the day, everything else put together, like Cátia was mentioning, the drop in tourism, which has a much larger importance for this country, is another kind of activities. They, at the end of the day, create economic inequality between countries in the way that this pandemic is developing. And to the extent, and Cátia can probably validate this or not, but to the extent that these differences are one of the determinants of the decision to migrate, you would expect something like that to happen. So that's thing number one. The second thing I want to say is that, Portugal is one of the countries with the lowest fertility rate, right, in the developed world, and or even in the whole world. And the thing is, this kind of questions the sustainability of our welfare system, right? Social security and so forth. I mean, we have a pay-as-you-go system, which means that, it's the current active population that pays for the retirement and, health benefits that are overwhelmingly consumed by older people. And if the demographic imbalance kind of, deteriorates, this means that we can instantly do one of two things: either cut benefits or we raise taxes. There's no way around it, right? And on the tax side, of course, we are not that competitive on many dimensions of the tax code. We've lost a lot of competitiveness in the last 20 years. A lot of countries decreased their tax burden. Portugal didn't really follow suit. We had a competitive tax advantage 20 years ago in some dimensions that kind of eroded. So that's one thing. The second thing is, you could try to come up with fertility kind of policies, child, promoting policies, child-friendly policies, and so forth. But the fact is that even if you come up with the perfect policies that will make people start having kids, we don't have the technology to make 18-year-old or 23-year-old kids being born immediately, fully capacitated to create value and generate tax revenue. That's not going to happen. I mean, so, those kind of policies make the problem worse before it becomes better in the long run, right? Because children do have, are a burden, so to speak, in the short run. And from a purely revenue perspective, I'm very happy for my kid to be a burden to me. But from a pure revenue perspective, they are a loss in the short run. So, Sweden went through a similar problem in the 90s. I think when we were in high school and we were studying like the inversion of the demographic pyramid, Sweden was the poster child of a Western nation aging pretty fast. And they were faced with the same kind of choice, right? They could either raise taxes and cut benefits, or they could open the gates. And, that's what they did. They opened the gates. So huge immigration went to Stockholm and the rest of Sweden, a lot for historical, by any historical measure. And this kind of, coupled with also the long-term policies of promoting a more friendly environment for young parents, kind of stabilized the social system in Sweden. Now we have a lot of, immigrants from Somalia, from Afghanistan, from Turkey, many of these destinations that went to Sweden, and they are the ones creating value added to make sure that the system is sustainable. Of course, Portugal has the problem, as opposed to Sweden, of not having the most attractive labor markets. We had some refugee families that were allocated to Portugal, and then the first thing that they did was to run away to Germany, right? So it's not. I mean, immigration has to be part of the solution. It's also maybe not the most politically correct to say thing, but Portugal has a workforce that is constituted of more than half of the population in working age between 25 and 65 has the 9th grade or less, which poses a challenge for all those upskilling needs that Susana was mentioning at the beginning, for digitalization efforts to be able to have an impact. This is also an obstacle. Ideally, we would all like to have engineers and STEM people coming from whatever destination to Portugal. We don't have the most attractive labor markets for that. So I feel that immigration has to be part of the solution for the Portuguese long-run sustainability of the welfare system, but just not how.
Can I just compliment? I agree with you, Pedro. I think we need both. We need we need all the skilled migrants we can get. We need all of these that may not have that level of education, because the economy needs them. And the studies that we have show that, they increase wages and employment at all levels. The other thing is, for Portugal specifically, there was a study done a few years ago that showed that it's not enough. Immigration, at the levels that you can forecast, it's not enough to invert this demographic crisis that we're facing. So we need all of these policies. We need the policies trying to support the decision of families to have kids, if they want to, obviously. And we also need these policies to attract all the migrants we can get at different levels of education. So just short comment.
Yes, and for this reason, I would like to ask Professor Susana Peralta if you think that makes sense that we are seeing rising some political speeches blaming migrants, and that kind of speech of hate that we start seeing rising in Europe. If in fact we need migrants to solve a problem, in an aging problem in Europe.
Okay, so first of all, we're not seeing those. That kind of political speech has been there, for many decades, actually. So it's not. There's nothing. There are very little things which are new about all these anti-immigrant, rhetorics in the politics of many European countries. Many of it is just recycled, really, from arguments that you had like before the Second World War and so on. Okay, so they're just reviving. Okay, so that's one thing. Secondly, I think that we have, I think that yes, we can discuss the migrant crisis on the basis of the needs that we as an aging European economy have of these young people with different types of skills. But I also think that it's ethically wrong to discuss it only on those grounds. Okay, these people are human beings. Oftentimes they are escaping conditions of war, persecution of at different levels, and even when they are just economic migrants, whatever that means, and of course Cátia is a better a better she's the expert in this field, by the way. I'm not. But even when these people are just economic migrants, in the sense that they just want to flee their home countries in order to escape, poverty and so on, oftentimes this economic deprivation is accompanied by kind of power deprivation. So these people, they are not represented by the political system of their country and so on. So, these people need us. Okay. So it's not all, I mean, and I think it's important that, that we as human beings take that dimension as well into account, not only the dimension that we need them as well. Okay. So that's another thing. So I also think that, of course, one cannot be it's not a world of fairy tales, and indeed, migrant population, immigrants, so inflows of people into our countries are good for our economy. But as with almost all changes in the economy, there are gainers and losers also from these migrants that come, or at least there are people that can perceive their current economic situation as a direct consequence of the immigrants that flow into the country. And that is at the heart of the political problem, of course, because even though we as economists, I really have a strong view in favor of having a good and strong and sound and accountable European-wide policy to attract migrants. I know that the political conditions are just not meant when you have, at the national level, many countries where parts of the population feel threatened by these migrants. And for instance, there's Pedro was mentioning Sweden. There's this nice paper that I came across once in a conference by a young economist from Sweden, who is, by the way, Iranian born. So he's himself comes from an immigrant background, and he finds, he looks at labor market shocks. In particular, he looks at mass layoffs. Okay, and then he looks at that at the sort of county level, so actually at the voting precinct level, so at a very small geographical scale, and he crosses that with the levels of education and skills of the people involved, and he finds that the places where you have more migrants and where you have, I'm not going to go into the details of the econometrics here, but basically, places with lots of migrants and places with mass layoffs occurring within the skill of the migrants that have flown into that place, that fosters actually the extreme right vote in Sweden, because that's in Sweden you have this party which is called the Swedish Democrats, who are actually a populist far right party. So people vote for these parties because they feel insecure. Okay, and I think that as much as we can, we should, I think, be be sympathetic to the migrants that are escaping terrible conditions, and by any standard, conditions which are way more difficult and catastrophic than the ones where these people in Sweden that feel insecure live in. I also think that we should be sympathetic to the people that feel insecure because of this, despite the fact that the mechanism may not even be there. But if they have this perception, sort of pretending that this perception doesn't exist, or just disqualifying these people as they're all fascists or they're racist. Some people who vote like this are not necessarily that way. They just feel very secure, and then they go for these, types of speeches, which are actually very dangerous and, of course, undermine our first of all, our democracy, and possibly as well our long-term sustainability, given that we do need these people in order to make our economy sustainable, not only, by the way, the social welfare system, because an economy that is relying only on very old people, is an economy that doesn't innovate, that doesn't produce, is a very boring place. Actually, in Portugal can become really boring if our pyramid just if our age pyramid just completely gets inverted. Okay, so yeah, so basically I'm not sure that I sorry, now I got lost in my reasoning. But no, but yes, what I mean is that in terms of Europe, I think that we really have a problem. So I do think that we need a policy, and we need it badly, and we need it fastly, not only because of the difficult and tragic situations that these people are escaping when they are coming from their countries, but also because of our own need to sort of make our economies funnier in a way and more sustainable, because we do need young people and working age people and so on. But I think that the politics is not there, and I don't think that it's going to be there for a while, because if anything, this pandemic has just worsened the sense of insecurity of people. Well, of course, no one knows, okay? Many things can happen, and the future belongs to the future. But if anything, this pandemic has thrown many people into very insecure and difficult situations. And therefore, for all these economic reasons, to vote for these extreme ideas are going to be stronger. The economic reasons, because of course, then there are people that vote for these extreme ideas because they really have a strong belief that people from different ethnic origins are like fundamentally different or fundamentally worse or whatever. I'm just talking about the economic bit of the explanation, which does exist, because nowadays we do have research that shows that the kind of vote for extreme right ideas does increase when people feel insecure. So I think that we have to deal with it actually in two, in a sort of two related and complementary ways. On the one hand, we do need to grab the hands of these people that are feeling insecure in our own countries, so that they can, in a way, sort of support the European-wide immigrant policy that we really need. And I don't think, by the way, that for the time being, at least, that's not really a big problem in Portugal. But if you go to, France, Spain, I mean, all these countries that have lived with big inflows of migrants for several decades now, like Sweden as well, Belgium, these are the Netherlands, obviously. These are the countries where you have well, and then Hungary and so on. It's also a big problem there, by the way. Greece, but I mean, again, for instance, when you look at Greece, what we've been doing to Greece, we as Europeans, is outrageous. I mean, we're paying them to keep these refugees and migrants in camps where basically the migrants have like a very poor life conditions, and they are like, they have 24-hour surveillance. Some of them have like electronic cards that specify the hours at which they can go out and back into the camp. So it's very, non-dignified living conditions for the migrants, but it also destroys, I mean, it's a very big negative externality for the locals. They are right. I want a lot of migrants in Europe. I do not want a settlement, in my backyard. So in a way, I'm not here to blame the Greeks who are against these people. Again, I think we have to be sympathetic as well to the people that live next door to these big migrant settlers, which are very poor in all sorts of dimensions. So again, just to summarize my ideas, I really think that we need to tackle the internal problems simultaneously with the international sort of European-wide policy, because otherwise the backlash is just going to be enormous, and then it's not going to work.
I agree very much. I don't know if you allow me to say just two things, just to complement what
I would like just to raise a question, yes. An open question, that is basically these insecure people, sometimes they ask for us, and sometimes we don't have the tools to answer them. And I would like to ask you, is that people say, but now, mainly in a crisis, they say, now we don't have employment for us that we live here. How can
that's what I was going to say.
From abroad can have an employment here if the locals don't have? That's what sometimes people ask.
Okay, so I was okay. So Susana's comments about like how people that feel more insecure for these populist parties. So I wanted to make a related point, which is oftentimes these people are not even in close contact with migrants because there is not a huge density of migrants in this area. So it's a paradox that is quite interesting that we have been observing in different, I mean, in the voting in different countries. And I would say that one thing that we specifically as researchers, as economists can do is to put out the evidence. And the evidence we have, and we have many studies that show that immigrants are the ones that foster innovation and employment creation in many places. If people hear about this, if the media focus less on the negative consequences of the presumed negative consequences of immigration and more on the positives, they will see this. So by now, we have a body of knowledge that shows that immigrants foster innovation and employment creation, okay? And so this means, and then when we look at the macro studies, we actually see that the average effect is that employment increases when there is this higher density of migrants. This is stuff that most people do not hear about. They are always afraid, and this is obviously natural, they are always afraid of losing their jobs. But the other thing we know is from research is that migrants and natives of a country are usually not regarded as substitutes by an employer. Employers do tend to prefer natives, and actually the immigrants will create jobs. So this sort of economic evidence is not out there. People don't hear about it in the media, in the popular discourse. And this is something that we should do, I think, to help minimize, okay? So I'm not saying this will solve everything, but this is important, and no one is responding to populist parties with this kind of evidence, okay? So that's one point. And then related, also very related to your second question, Hugo, about how can we give jobs to people when there are no jobs for nationals? So on the one hand, it can be solved because many of these migrants create their own jobs, and actually sometimes they also employ people. The other one is also at the root cause of this irregular migration to Europe. People go this way, risking their lives, I mean, knowingly, because they don't have a legal pathway. They don't see a legal way, for example, going to a consulate in their home country and applying for a job, to come to Europe for a job. We should have this, and this should be done together with integration policies. And what I mean here by integration is that we have, say, sectors of the economy that are asking for immigrants, and then you create a visa process where you can have these presumably less skilled, less educated migrants coming and fill shortages. Because we also know that, I mean, some of the jobs that we have in Europe are jobs that Europeans are not really keen on taking. And this is not just a matter of wages. As economists, we know that, I mean, if there is a shortage of labor, you could just increase the wage and then natives would become willing to take them. But sometimes this does not happen, or that wage is too high and you would just close that sector and open it elsewhere. So migrants can be a solution here. This should be done together, okay? The two sides, integration and legal pathways have to be thought together to avoid these situations that Susana was mentioning, in which many European countries like France or Belgium, and increasingly other countries, have these problems of integration because people come, don't have jobs. And I mean, yeah, and by the way, there are also studies showing that crime does not increase with immigration, which is another fact that we should be putting out there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Pedro, go ahead.
No,
No, I mean, I was just saying that people have this image of the labor market as like a stock, you know, like a box of apples, and then each of us grabs an apple. And of course, if I eat my apple, then there, you know, at some point there are not going to be any more apples. But the labor market just doesn't work like that, because, you know, there are trees being planted, so there will be more apples, and then there's a price mediating it, and then of course there are the skills. So some apples are better for some people, and you know. So that the matching means that you have to find the right skills for the right job. And that's, of course, a two-sided thing. So it's good for me to find the right job for my skills. And then it's good for the employer to find the right employee with the skills for the job. Well, you know, so, I mean, the labor market is not a bag of apples. But of course, it's very difficult to communicate this for the people. And again, the people that have been losing relatively, because when I said a while ago that, of course, you cannot compare, the situation of a migrant, even if it's just an economic migrant that comes from some, northern African country escaping like really deep poverty. You cannot compare that to these, Swedes who vote Swedish Democrats, or for the Belgian that vote the Vlaams Belang or whatever. Okay. They are, the degree of absolute poverty is of course very different, but the degree of relative poverty is not necessarily very different. And it's very likely, and we have to respect that perception that the European individual feels poorer, than this African that really comes to Europe and is really deeply poor. Okay, because people make relative judgments. I mean, we've learned that with behavioral economists. We don't make absolute judgments, right? And and that's human. So we really have to help these people out. But of course, as Cátia was saying, it's important that we communicate to them and that they understand that maybe even this inflow of migrants, by the way, will also contribute for social security, and that then we can pay them, more generous transfers, have a better welfare state and all that. That's good for them. And also from the perspective of the labor market, these people are younger, they innovate, more diverse working environments are, in many ways better. And we just had, by the way, I'm going to stop now, but we just had like the European Cup, and you see that these very diverse teams with like lots of different backgrounds, they do splendid things. And you can just imagine like comparing that to a team where they would just grab, the best players from a given region of Portugal, as opposed to these teams that have all these backgrounds, that have immigrated to the European countries in different points. And that's what, diversity is great for economic productivity, for innovation in teams and all that. But it's a hard message to convey. And again, some people lose from it. And it's important that we find ways to actually share the gains with everyone.
Can I just add one, Susana? Your analogies are perfect, but on those who lose, the studies we have are that immigrants that arrived earlier that lose. Okay, so when we look at wages and employment, the people in a country that lose with the arrival of new immigrants are the immigrants that were here before, because they are more substitutes.
Yeah, because they are more substitutes. Yes,
exactly.
Of course.
So even that we can answer. By now, we have a lot of studies. The hard challenge here is to communicate these facts in a way that people understand, that they believe, and that,
yes,
reflects on the politicians.
Cátia, okay, of course, but even if the people that lose the most, or the people that are more represented in the losing population, are these people that are more substitutes to the inflow, to the people that come, you still have lots of non or low skilled individuals in the host country who lose not necessarily for immigration. They are losing for many other things, losing relatively. And they may still feel threatened. So
yes, absolutely. Feeling threatened and economic indicators are things that are very different. So I don't.
Just a couple of things on that. So first, if you're curious about the paper that Susana was talking about, and the Iranian origin, Swedish-born, actually he was born in Iran still. His name is Cyrus Dedari. He was actually my TA in Stockholm.
Oh, was he? Because I met him in this conference. Very nice guy, actually.
Yeah, he was my TA, macro TA at Stockholm. And it's a paper with Erik Andersson. And it's a very interesting paper in the sense that it kind of touches with something that Cátia also said. So one of the things that Cátia mentioned after Susana started talking about the topic was that a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment comes precisely from people who have the least contact with immigrants. And actually, that's what Cyrus' paper shows, that when you have workplace contact with immigrants, anti-immigrant sentiment lowers. And I think this is a lesson that we learned in other ways, right? And that kind of, I think the European Union also failed to acknowledge in a much deeper and decisive way, which is, when you have political fragmentation, as we have in Europe, right? I'm not just talking about now the immigrant side, but, Portuguese versus, you have Gerard Discain, coming up with a pigs term, right? It's much easier to kind of, build negative sentiments towards symbols and words than it is towards people, right? So if you don't have, if you don't have policies that create a common identity, foster mobility, I went to Sweden. I lived in Europe. I lived in Germany, Sweden, and Italy, right? So I have people in those countries who are the face to me of those countries. So they are humanized. They're not just a flag or a symbol. They're people, right? People who I've shared meals, people who I've talked to, and that way, through these kind of positive experiences and getting to know diversity, as Susana was talking, is one of the things that brings this value added and an increased tolerance. Tolerance is a bad word. I don't like it that much, but I would say an increased ability to see, common ground. I like more that expression than tolerance. And I think this was a bit left behind by the institutions, but it's also at the root. And this might not be the most political correct thing to say, but this whole thing about, looking at these political parties that prey on despair and economic insecurity and other fears. They kind of tend to demonize the people who fall prey to these kind of movements. And they never kind of, we as a society, we like to label them, and we kind of stay away from them as if they were like, the incarnation of evil, as if they are exogenously kind of programmed to be like that. And instead of us having a proactive attitude to understand why people feel like that. Okay. And I mean, I give you an example. I'm sorry if this is a personal example, but, you go a couple of generations behind and people would live all their lives in a little village, right? I mean, my grandmother, for example, she was born and lived all her life in a little village in the interior of Portugal. And for example, the only interaction she had with people of gypsy origins was the one time they came to the village and robbed her house. So, I mean, she's never been everywhere else. She has the 4th grade. My grandmother is not an evil person, okay? I love her very much, but I don't think, she has a very positive view of gypsies as a whole. And of course, this is a problem because, a lot of times, most people are not trained to distinguish correlation from causation. The average Joe doesn't work like that. I mean, historically, a false positive was much less harmful for our evolution as a species than a false negative, right? So that's how you build prejudice. And it's intrinsically genetically programmed in us for us to behave like that. And it's through information, it's through diversity, as Susana Peralta was mentioning. Another anecdotal example. So we had like a local football team in that village. And one of the first Black persons that, most people in the village had seen was Jackson, which was a Brazilian guy who came to the village, and he played for the football team. And he was amazing. I mean, he was an incredible player and he was loved by everyone.
Pedro is just surprised that I was the one coming up with football as an example and not himself. So, so now he's just, because he has, of course, many more things to say about football than I have. So just go ahead, Pedro. I'm loving it. I'm loving it.
But
it's great. No, it's a great example. Exactly what you are saying is really great.
But the cool thing was that in a local village, and like if you play in Benfica or Sporting or whatever, people end the game and they go to the local cafe and they mingle, right? So this interaction, and this builds on Cyrus's paper that was mentioned by Susana and the comments that Cátia did. When you actually interact with these people in a positive way, right? I mean, good things come out of it, and this is how you build common ground. All of a sudden, Black people were not, people we were at war with in Africa and stuff like that, right? And maybe they went through a rough neighborhood that is predominantly, also due to very poor integration kind of policies that were predominantly of ethnic origin, and they had a bad experience, and then that kind of marked them for life. No, there they have a continuous experience with someone of Black ethnic background, and that was positive, and that I think that made huge wonders for the end of racism, if you want, in this kind of village. And I think one of the key things that we need to do is not to respond this kind of, these people that support these kind of ideas, they seem so kind of far away from how we are and how we feel, but we live a little bit in a bubble. I mean, all of us here, I don't know about Hugo, but probably also had an international experiences. We've lived abroad. We contacted with people of different origins. Sometimes, I mean, you are a bit whiter, but I'm a bit darker. So every now and then I've been in a position where things would be reversed, right? Where I was perceived as an ethnic minority, and it's like, and we really need to reach out to those people. And what I feel is at the root of the problem.
Okay, we reached now the end of this special edition. Thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure to have you here. And for you that listen to us, stay connected.